But economic dynamics meant that you had Muslim merchants who went out, and you created what was essentially a medieval version of a major tricontinental common market. Now, the merchants didn't come along and conquer trade routes. Islam spread into West Africa because local kingdoms and local people were interacting with Muslim merchants, who then brought Sufi teachers. And the major instruments, rather than military commanders, the major instruments for the doubling of the size of the Muslim world between, say, the year 1000 and the year 1600, the major instruments for that doubling were merchants, and were Sufi teachers, and were wandering preachers. The major conquest in that period is the Ottoman Empire's conquest of the Balkans. And there what you have is a new kind of conquest that did not result in the conversion of most of the people, but in fact rather created a cosmopolitan empire. Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and much of Central Asia became areas that were incorporated into the global Islamic community by means, economic, religious, preaching, and so on, by networking means rather than conquest. Now, let me suggest History 109 at Georgetown, which is the history of the Muslim world, which sometimes I teach, but at any rate.
Thank you for that answer.
Takes too long.
The next question. Is it true that the number of Muslim terrorist attacks that happen is higher than the number of terrorist attacks performed by people of any other religion? If so, why is that the case?
Just quickly, statistically, the answer to that depends upon what your time frame is. If you are talking 1995 to the present, there are probably more Muslim terrorist attacks done by Muslims than others. But even within that framework, you have a variety of other major military militant operations that have a terrorism element into it. It is interesting, for example, that the people who invented suicide bombing as a really effective counter-military effort were Sri Lankans and not Muslims. But if you expand it, there is a study done by Audrey Cronin, done for RAND, the security thing, that studies 500 militant and terrorist movements for the last 50 years. And her statistical breakdown, if you use the last 50 years, then the majority of the actual terrorist activities, hijackings and things like that, were done either by radical nationalists or Maoists and leftists and communist revolutionaries. But that is a good social science statistical thing. The answer in terms of the question, I think within the tonality, is that yes, the most visible and the most effective and the most numerous terrorist attacks in the last decade have probably been done by people claiming to be Muslim, which is why then it becomes so important to look at what is it that states are doing about, what is it that Muslim majority states are doing to try and suppress that.
Next question. How do Islamic leaders respond to violence in a theological framework? How do they persuade people against violence?
Most political leaders, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, are not very good in their theology. I would not expect President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt to provide a very effective theological counter to terrorism. I do expect, and I have heard, the Grand Mufti of Egypt do that. I think at this point, as we look at Muslim leaders in Muslim majority countries, Those that remain military oriented and authoritarian in their nature are not very good in theology of countering violence because they engage in violence themselves. I would say, however, that people like Abdurrahman Wahid in Indonesia, people like Mahathir in Malaysia, people like Anwar Ibrahim do provide the kind of religious creedal base that I was talking about, looking at the Quran's emphasis on protection of widows, protection of children, protection of the innocent, setting rules for, these are not pacifists. These are people who say if you are going to have a war that is for a just cause, you have to fight that war in a just way. And this is the sort of argument that they would use.
All right, next question. You said the future depends on peace between Christians and Muslims. What is meant by future, and how important is it in this ongoing globalization?
That, yes, I say that, but when I said it in my talk, I was quoting the 138 Muslim leaders, and I was quoting the section from ISNA. But yes, I say that. I say that because the future of humanity depends upon human beings being able to cope with the fact of diversity and pluralism that is now inescapable. It is no longer possible to do what the Puritans did in the 17th century. They didn't get along with the Anglicans, with the Anglican Church in Britain. They didn't like living in the Netherlands, and so they always had North America that they could go to. In the Islamic tradition, I like to call this the Hijra tradition. That, you know, when you are living in an evil society, in the historic tradition of Islam, it says you can, maybe should, engage in Hijra. Maybe you should leave where you go. The problem now is that we live in a world where you can't yet, until we can get up to the moon or to Mars or something like that, there isn't any place where you can get away from all of the other people of the world. And so that the biggest challenge now for the future is for human beings to cope with the fact that people that they're going to have to live with are people that they are going to, in the terminology of the common word, that they're going to have to love. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be all warm and squishy and fuzzy, but it does mean that you have to be able to live within a framework of a pluralistic acceptance of difference. And quite frankly, in my religious opinion, you know, not a factual sort of thing, but in my religious opinion, the great religious traditions are the only sources for real inspiration to be able to create that necessary sense of pluralism and coping with diversity. Marxism didn't do very well with it in the Soviet Union. Maoism hasn't done very well with it in China. Atheism didn't do very well with it in Cambodia. I think that it has to be what we would think of as a religious framing, but it has to be a pluralistic religious framing.